So a lot of people feel confident, okay, the candidate has done it. But we also have to be careful and look, have they actually presented an overview? Sometimes candidates write generic statements or just a sentence like, overall, this data was very interesting. Overall, there are lots of different numbers. So even though they might use keywords like an overall or in general, are they actually presenting a proper overview? We can also see some things here that are being highlighted. So Erica has just highlighted a few other aspects. And if you notice, this is kind of tapping into what Erica was saying, this listing of details rather mechanically. There's nothing wrong with putting things in order. But if we just say, okay, this lake was the biggest, the next lake was the next biggest, the third lake was the third biggest, or just say Michigan was 20%, Superior was 59%. If it has no general explanation and there's just a list of facts, this is what we mean by quite mechanical. And the other thing, as a teacher, as a trainer, we have to be looking at the data. As Erica showed there in bands 5, 6, and 7, one of the things you need to be doing is at least getting the key data or the main points. You don't have to get every single detail, but if it's missing some of the bigger points, then that's going to be an issue.
Thank you, Mark. So task achievement is something that many IELTS candidates do struggle with. So we wanted to add on a few pointers here as well. So for this sample task, one of the main things that we notice when looking at the data initially is that all lakes saw a decrease in the amount of ice cover across the 2 periods. So this would be one of those key features we would expect to see in every response. If this is missing, then that would detract from the band score for task achievement. Lakes Erie and Ontario experienced minimal change. Oh, sorry, my controls are going crazy. So we can see that Erie and Ontario, they are more similar across the 2 periods, so that we might group them together and note that their change is minimal or negligible or not quite measurable. And we might group the other 3 together. Lakes Erie, Huron, and Superior had higher amounts of ice cover, so that's 1. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but that's 1, 2, 3 here as well. Though Huron and Superior had larger declines in comparison to Lake Erie, which had minimal change, as we just noted. Lake Erie also had the highest amount of ice cover, while Lake Ontario had the least amount of ice cover. So these are the main data points that stick out to us when we're looking at the chart overall. So these would be the main features or the key features that we would expect to be included. And now, of course, you can group that in a number of different ways. But this is also a really good exercise if you are training students or preparing candidates to take the IELTS test, to just take a moment to look at the data and really be able to identify what those main trends are, because that's going to affect their writing performance overall. For task achievement, we also want to look at writing an overview. So there should be, there's often, I should say, an overarching trend. As we pointed out with our sample that we're working with today, the overarching trend is that all lakes saw a decrease in ice cover. And then we can supplement that overarching trend with some key details from the feature or grouping of trends. Now here's a sample overview sentence. Again, using that signposting language, overall, all Great Lakes saw a decrease in ice cover across the 2 time periods, though the difference was more measurable in some, whereas minimal in Lakes Erie and Ontario. So as Mark pointed out earlier, that nicely summarizes the data as a full, complete picture, whereas in our sample, it does not. Here's another option. Generally speaking, all lakes experienced a decline in the amount of ice coverage, and in some cases, such as Lake Superior, this was substantial. And lastly, in general, it is clear that despite marked differences in ice cover across 3 lakes, all of the Great Lakes experienced some amount of ice cover decrease over the 2 periods. Now, this is also a really great exercise to do with students, is having extra practice in writing an overview statement. It will help them to think about how to do this in a number of different ways and make them more flexible in their writing, as well as how to express themselves. And it's also good because you don't always just want to give students a task 1 sample and say, you know, write an essay. Really honing those skills, it's a good idea to break it down into these smaller bits as well.
Yeah, it's a great point, actually, Erica, because we have these 4 criteria. So we know that there's specific things to be working on. These can be completely 4 separate teaching moments or 4 separate teaching skills that you're just focusing entirely on. How do you write an overview, and practicing with your students, thinking about if somebody puts data in an overview, is it an overview or is it a description? So we can think about that. Anyway, onwards, Erica. What's next?
Coherence and cohesion. So again, I'll just introduce the different band levels. At band 5, we have presents information with some organization, but there might be a lack of overall progression. So for example, this might be an essay that does use some of that signposting language, but it doesn't quite connect with the actual content that is in the essay. So there's no real progression. Again, makes inadequate or inaccurate or potentially overuse of some of these cohesive devices. So there's kind of a disconnect where perhaps the student has learned some of these cohesive devices, such as overall, first and foremost, but it's not quite connecting with the idea that they're expressing. Also, and I think this is a good point, it might be repetitive because of lack of referencing and substitution. So for our homework example, constantly referring to Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, blah, 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 Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, rather than substituting or saying these lakes, these 2 lakes, these major lakes, or, you know, the aforementioned lakes, or something like that. This often comes up as an issue with candidates at about that 5 to 6 borderline level. At band 6, the candidate will arrange information and ideas coherently, and there is clear overall progression. So we no longer have that disconnect between the cohesive devices and the ideas being expressed, and the essay itself will flow a lot better. Uses cohesive devices effectively, but cohesion within or between sentences may be faulty or mechanical. So in this case, we might have a learner that is really relying on these devices in a mechanical kind of way. So they know how to use them, they are using them appropriately, but it might sound a bit robotic. Or if they are writing more complex sentences, there might be some loss of coherence within the sentence itself. And they may not always use referencing clearly or appropriately, but they are making more of an effort than at the band 5 level. And lastly, for band 7, the ideas and informations are logically organized, and it is a clear progression throughout the entire essay. There are no issues with the organization overall. At band 7, the candidate is also able to use a range of cohesive devices appropriately, but again, there's still some room for over and under use. So let's have a look at our sample. Again, not expecting you to read it, but we have highlighted some of these features.
So when you did your homework, when you looked through this, okay, how easy was it for you to read? Were there any parts that you had to kind of go back and read again or think, well, hold on, why is this point followed by this point? Or did it make perfect sense to you? Was it very easy and you think, this seems quite normal to me? Now, we can't say what is a perfect order. There is no right or wrong answer of what you want to do first. But naturally, what you might lead with is one of the biggest things, the most noticeable things. So those big differences or those big trends, those would likely be the ones that you start with. And then think about some of the referencing or the substitution. Are you referring back to something that you've just mentioned? Are you substituting one word with another? So we use things like famous people substituted with celebrities, substituted with stars. You know, this is the kind of way that we make writing join together. Now, this one was a little bit awkward because sometimes it started the sentences with which or while, when normally we'd expect that as part of a longer complex sentence. And there may also have been some times when you thought, well, hold on, why are we starting with this? And why have we started with Lake Ontario? And then we've mentioned Lake Ontario in the middle. And now we're mentioning Lake Ontario again at the end. Is it a really important thing that has to be contrasted? Or was it not arranged that logically? So, lexical resource. All right, let's have a look at the first one, Erica. So the first one, candidates have a limited range of vocabulary. Maybe there's just a minimal or adequate use for the task. You know, they get in the main kind of keywords you would expect. They might also have noticeable errors in spelling. Their word formation is kind of not quite there. But often what we see is either the writing is okay, but it doesn't stand out, or that it causes some difficulty for the reader. So it doesn't mean just because they have a bad spelling, they get a 5, or because they're using limited words, they have a 5. It might be entirely one of those things or a blend of both. What about 6, Erica?
At a 6, the candidate is using an adequate range of vocabulary for the task, so they're not as limited. They have an adequate range for the topic that they've been given. They are also a bit more, potentially, they're a bit more creative and they might attempt to use less common vocabulary. But however, this doesn't mean that they always use it 100% correctly. So we would expect to see mistakes at band 6. But sometimes they get it right and sometimes they get it wrong. They also make some errors in spelling and or word formation. So for example, produced versus production, that kind of thing, if they're doing a diagram or something. However, this does not impede communication because the examiner can deduce what was meant by the writer. At a band 7, we're using a sufficient range of vocabulary to allow some flexibility and precision. So this is the key difference between a band 6 and a band 7. Here, the writer has much more range of what they're trying to say, and their message is a lot more precise. There's no confusion around what point they're trying to make as well. At a band 7, they're also able to use less common lexical items with some awareness of style and collocation. So this can help really emphasize a point. So for example, if they want to really drive home the fact that Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, for example, had negligible differences in ice cover over the 2 periods, they would be able to emphasize this using the style of writing. Note that at band 7, there are still occasional errors in word choice, spelling, and or word formation. So even at band 7, we're still not looking at a 100% perfect essay.
And as teachers, as trainers, one thing we want you to think about is it better to tell students to just, only focus on getting accuracy? If you're not sure what word to use, just don't do it. Just play safe, make sure you get more accurate. Or is it better to at least try to use the word? You might get it right, you might not be sure. Have a think about that. We might come back to that later in the Q&A section. So let's have a look at it, Erica.
Right, so here's our homework sample. Again, so we've highlighted some lexical issues, I guess you could say, where they're not quite right. Some of the phrasing and some of the word choice, it does have an impact on the overall message.
And yeah, the first thing that we notice, maybe you noticed, there might be certain words that stand out, like twice excessive, triple copious. We're thinking, okay, have they got a confused, like a double adjective here that they shouldn't have been using? So that could be one thing. There are also other areas we can look at when we're looking at lexical resource. One of the things you might know is a repeated or repetitive use of the same chunks or the same groups of words. So here we can stand out and say, well, actually, they're using this word, the period from. There's nothing wrong with using it. You have to describe it sometimes. But if it's used excessively in close proximity or very close to each other, it becomes more noticeable as a reader. It's fine, but it might not be the best display of language.
And I'll just add here, this came across in a few samples. We wouldn't penalize someone for this necessarily, but Ontario Lake, the naming conventions, this would fall under more of a band 7 because this is more of a style awareness. But in English, we often would call it Lake Ontario. So the writer isn't going to be penalized for this, but it would be something that the examiner would pick up on as more of a style awareness around naming conventions.
And it's important to remember these IELTS tasks are designed in a clever way that they're supposed to elicit a range of ability. It has to be achievable or manageable for a lower end. It has to give room for somebody who's, moderately comfortable or intermediate ability. But it also has to have the flexibility that if somebody is an exceptionally good writer, that they can show that style, they can show that nuance of awareness, that they know that precise way to describe something. But again, like Erica said, that's going to be at the band 7 minimum or above, where people really get everything nailed.
Okay, I believe I've got Zoom controls on my screen in the way, but I believe this slide, we're going to move on to grammatical range and accuracy, starting with band 5, where the writer is only using a limited range of structures. So they're really kind of relying on those set grammatical structures that they've learned in class. They may attempt complex sentences, but these almost always will contain errors. They're going to be less accurate, whereas the simple sentences, they'll be able to write with no mistakes. And again, as I just said, they're going to have frequent grammatical errors and punctuation, and this might cause difficulty for the reader. However, at a band 6, the writer is able to use a mix of simple and complex sentence forms. They are still making some errors, especially in those complex sentences. However, the reader is able to kind of skip over them. They're still able to understand the overall message being written. At a band 7, the writer is able to use a variety of complex sentences and structures, and most sentences are error-free. So at a band 7, you've got more control of grammar and punctuation. Again, note that there's still room for errors, and that's true all the way up to a band 8 and 9 as well. So it's more about error density rather than having overall perfection. And if you don't mind, we're going to kind of go quickly through this so we can get to task 2 and get to the questions in the time for today as well.
Right. So in this homework sample, you had a chance to review the grammar, and what you might have noticed highlighted here is sometimes we had either very short sentences, or we had sentences that could have been part of a longer complex sentences, but were left isolated on their own, like which was twice excessive than Michigan in the period of. So what we can see is we've got other issues. Now, before I mentioned this use of triple copious or twice excessive. Now, I might have to think, was the word copious right? So that's a lexical choice, but here what I've got is 2 words. I've got 2 adjectives together, which I wouldn't expect to see. So I would have to decide as a teacher or an examiner, okay, I'm going to keep this one as entirely focused on a grammar penalization and this one as a lexical. We wouldn't try to penalize somebody twice for a mistake. We need to try to separate it.
Apologies for jumping ahead.
So if we'd had a look, going back to our results, Erica, what was the overall consensus on the criteria for task 1?
So the sample that we've given you for your homework is indicative of a flat 5. So a band 5 for task achievement, band 5 for lexical resource, coherence and cohesion, and grammatical range and accuracy.
So well done to the majority who also seem to be on the same lines. Okay, what about task 2?
All right, so jumping ahead to task 2. Again, here's the sample that you had from homework. It's also been dropped into the chat box if you want to follow along now as well. So the topic that we had for this assignment was, oh, sorry, that's not the right topic, but it was the one on employment, is the one that we've used. This is everybody's results that we were able to collect right before starting the session this morning. So you'll see that for task response, which we have for task 2 instead of task achievement, most people are thinking about a band 6. For coherence and cohesion, again, most people are falling in the band 6 range, with some people thinking it's a bit stronger for coherence and cohesion. Lexical resource, again, the majority is in the 6. And with grammar, we're feeling a bit stronger with higher numbers at that 7 range.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So for task response, when we look at this question, regardless of whatever question it is, we need to have a clear position. We need to be able to see what is somebody saying. Do we understand what their opinion is? We don't care what their opinion is. We don't care if they completely disagree or agree. We don't care if they don't have any strong ideas. We just need to see that being expressed. And do they have ideas that support? So if they say they agree, have they used ideas that kind of back up that? Or if they acknowledge that people have a different opinion, do they have ideas to support that point of view? Those extension of ideas and examples, are they adequately supported? Do they make sense in what people are saying? So if they're saying that there's a strong point, do they follow up with an example or an exemplification that kind of backs that up? And do they have a conclusion that's linked to the position, to the question, and summarizes up things? Doesn't introduce new ideas. It doesn't introduce brand new things. It just overall adds into the ideas. Okay, let's have a look at the response then, Erica.
All right, so for task response at a band 5, you'll see that a lot of these mirror the task 1 responses, but they are slightly different because the type of writing is different. So at band 5, the candidate is addressing the task only partially. and the format may be incorrect in some areas. They do express a position, but the development is not always clear. So they might clearly state that this is why countries suffer from unemployment, but they may not show us exactly how they got to that idea. And there may be no conclusions drawn. So they might have presented a lot of ideas, but they don't go anywhere, for example. They also present some main ideas, but they could be limited and not sufficiently developed. And this is similar to what we see in task 1 when we talk about mechanical recounting of detail and data. In task 2, that kind of comes across as just kind of lists of ideas. So for example, in the homework sample around unemployment, looking at why unemployment happens and what the government can do to solve this issue, it might be just a list of ideas rather than much development there. In a band 6, they are able to address all parts of the task, although they might spend more time on one area than others, so it might be not completely balanced, but that's all right for band 6. They present a relevant positions, although some of the conclusions may become unclear or repetitive at times. And they present some of these relevant main ideas, but again, some of them are inadequately developed or unclear, but they don't detract from the overall message in the same way that they do at a band 5. In a band 7, the writer is able to address all parts of the task with none of those qualifiers that I mentioned at bands 5 and 6. They present a clear position, and this is evident throughout the writing. That is a main difference between the 6th and the 7th performance. They're also able to extend and support their main ideas. However, they might overgeneralize in some areas, or they might be lacking some of that supporting detail or focus that we would see at the higher levels of band 8 and 9. So when we're working with students and preparing them for the IELTS test, we can't, just like looking at task achievement in detail like we did for task 1, with task 2, this is kind of a checklist that we would look at when we're reviewing a student's writing. So is their position clear? How clearly can you find it? And can you follow that development of how they got to that position? Do they support their position? How fully does the writer address the task? Do they include relevant ideas? Are they able to extend on those ideas? How clearly do those ideas relate to the prompt? Sometimes in task 2, we often get candidates that go off on tangents or tangential ideas, and then they end up not really answering the question that's being asked. Or in some other cases, you might have candidates that are relying on sample essays that they read in a book that they think will fit, which usually don't. And IELTS examiners are also trained to spot this as well. Are those conclusions clearly drawn? Can we follow their essay throughout? Does it make sense all the way through, from going from A, B to C? And then lastly, are the ideas repetitive? Is the writer simply restating the same idea again and again, or are they actually developing those ideas? So again, not expecting you to read this on the screen right now. You do have the samples dropped in the chat if you haven't done the pre-task assignment, so you can follow along. But again, we're just going to be going through this sample response and highlighting some of these key features that an examiner might notice.
Yeah, so with this one, we felt that, okay, the introduction just presented the topic in a very simple manner. They did put forward some ideas in the supporting paragraphs, but those ideas were not clearly linked. They're not really logical. And this conclusion is quite obvious in that it doesn't actually summarize the argument. It wasn't really the same point. And remember, the question was about what are the causes and how do we deal with it? And this is straight into how do we deal with the situation, which is fine. But at some point you would expect to see a better discussion of the causes. So that's what we'll be looking at. Now we're going to look at the cohesion coherence. If we have a look at all three together, Erica.
Sure.
And then what we'd notice if we have a look at the difference between a task 1 and a task 2, there's something that stands out. So it's lots of the same things. There's about logical order, about cohesion, about linking words, referencing and substitution. But we'll notice here at a band 6 and a band 7 is the idea of paragraph writing. Really, for a task 2, it's a longer piece of writing. We'd need to see paragraphing. It doesn't mean you just have to have separate blocks, but those ideas must make sense. A paragraph is not just a separate block, but it's an idea that I'm talking about something that's logical, is supported, and it backs up. And then the next paragraph either extends that original topic or it changes focus slightly in some way. So here, when we were looking at the cohesion and coherence in this one, some of the things that might have stood out that we've highlighted here, that there's a talk about straight into one way to deal with this situation. Well, is it clear what the situation is? Yes, we know what the question is because we've all had to read it. But again, as a writer, the student would have to present that in some way. Sometimes there's a tendency for some students, not all, but they see the words that I have to use, linking devices. So they think, right, I'm going to get every single linking device that I know. First of all, furthermore, second of all, in addition, likewise, in contrast. And they think every single sentence has to start. Of course they do. But again, it gets into this idea of if we're overusing them or not using them in the correct way, it becomes awkward, it becomes mechanical, and it doesn't really show a flexibility in language. Was there anything else, Erica, that you'd like?
I think that was it. We can move on to Lexical Resource. Apologies for kind of going ahead. Again, this is going to mirror task 1 quite a bit, and there are no major differences for Lexical Resource band descriptors for task 1 and task 2. So again, just do a quick recap. At band 5, the writer is much more limited in what they're able to say, and the errors are causing difficulty for the reader. Whereas at band 6, there are still errors, but as a reader, we can kind of jump over them and we can kind of surmise or guess what the writer is trying to say. And then at band 7, we do have that higher level of flexibility and precision in communicating the message. However, there are still some errors at that level. So again, we're just looking at paragraph 1 in the sample essay that we've given out. In this one, there are quite a few phrases. And again, the examiner is going to have to decide whether this falls under repetition for lexical resource or that lack of substituting and referencing in coherence and cohesion. But as you can see highlighted on the screen, we have a lot of the same terminology being repetitively used within one paragraph. So the phrase graduates, young and experienced graduates, is used repeatedly throughout, and likewise for the term specialists. And you'll see this throughout the rest of the essay as well, but due to screen size and timing, we've only highlighted this one paragraph.
And again, this is a great opportunity when we think about training, about teaching students, about getting them ready for IELTS. You don't have to always write complete essays. You can focus on one paragraph, say that everybody has to talk about the problems, and break it down and think, okay, we're going to do it as a paragraph. So are we thinking about the vocabulary? We've already dealt with the cohesion, but we're going to look at the vocabulary, highlighting words that are repetitively used. Is there a better word that could be used here? Are there any words that are used that kind of cause a little bit confusion? Are there any other words that are okay, but not in this context or this situation? Okay, and then we might highlight certain things. Young, inexperienced graduates are able to get a place. Could be good, but get a place on a foundation program, on a graduate employment scheme, get a place in a company that hasn't been extended. Highly qualified graduates are able to share their enthusiasm and novelty. Okay, enthusiasm, good. Novelty is probably not the best use of word here. So again, we kind of understand, but it's not exceptionally clear.
Sorry, just conscious of time, and I want to try to get to some of the questions, and we do have a homework assignment for the next one. So we're going to kind of go quickly through grammatical range and accuracy. I think this is a bit more straightforward. Again, the band descriptors for the 5, 6, 7, not different to the task 1. So we'll go ahead and continue on. This is looking at paragraph 2 from the sample.
Yes. So one of those things is, do the errors have an impact on our meaning and understanding? And we can kind of see that they do in certain places. And this idea, like the task 1, there's nothing wrong with a simple sentence, but are there simple sentences that could be joined together? Is it just saying one thing with a period or a full stop and then the next point? So if we're seeing an over-reliance on this, we kind of get an indication. So going back to our early results, all the things that we highlighted, it is a task 2. It has used some paragraphs. It has kind of talked about the topic. But this one, because of the lack of the development of the essay, of the broken connection, the repetitive use of language and sometimes inaccurate vocabulary, and the over-reliance on simple sentences, this would be, again, a flat 5, a 5, 5, 5, 5 for each criteria. So if you had a 5, or if you were between a 5 and a 6, not sure where to stand, that was
all right.
Correct.
Thank you very much, Mark. We're going to go through some of the questions that were submitted during the registration process. We'll try to get through as many as we can. The first question that comes up are there differences in the public band descriptors and the descriptors examiners use in the exam? So the short answer for this is no, not really. The examiners have a booklet, and much of that booklet is actually outlining the test day procedures, safety and security of the exam, some descriptions on how to ensure fairness to all candidates, and all of the kind of other stuff that you don't see that goes into IELTS examining as well. So the main criteria are there. There are no secrets kind of behind smoke and mirrors that you need to worry about. So the public band descriptors are a fantastic resource to be using in your classrooms with students.
So to what extent is writing structure important? Well, it underpins a lot, but like we said, we're looking at 4 criteria. So yes, it is an important one. Each of those 4 criteria, none is more important than the other. So it's a very teachable idea. It's a very focused idea that you can look at individual paragraphs. Overall, yes, writing structure is very important. But even if a student doesn't get it perfect, they can heighten strengths in other areas, but we'd want to try to balance those areas.
The next one, what makes writing so difficult? Writing is difficult even in your own language, in your first language. I mean, if you think about writing, it's a profession, being a journalist, an author. So it is a skill that you need to hone. And one thing that makes writing quite different is how similar writing styles are in your L1 versus L2. So the differences in your first language between English, that's also in the mechanics of writing, in the linguistic kind of features, but also in the styles. So for example, some countries may have the tendency to quote great thinkers or minds, whereas English, that's often seen as plagiarism, or not having your own idea, not developing your own idea. So noticing those differences in the overall style is also very important. And as Dr. Mottram mentioned in the first session, that reading and increasing the amount that students read and analyzing text really has a crossover impact on other skills as well, such as writing and speaking. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, I just want to point out a really great exercise, and I know Mark has mentioned it throughout, and I think Dr. Mottram mentioned it in the first session as well. But practicing with students doesn't always need to just be writing a practice task 2 sample. You can really have a lot of activities just by analyzing and breaking down a task 2 like we did today. I know, like Mark and myself, we could continue talking about the task 2 sample that we've given you for homework for probably another 2 hours, and we could probably make like a whole semester activity curriculum all around just analyzing that and how to improve that. So that helps keep activities more interesting for students as well. Which leads me to the next question, Mark. How do we motivate students to practice writing?
Well, exactly as Erica said, and as Dr. Joanna said last week, it's breaking stuff down, having a wider range of reading, and then kind of tying in those things. Writing can be quite enjoyable and quite fun if it's broken down into kind of little tasks, rather than saying, okay, you've got 40 minutes and you've just got to create this essay. Lots of writing can be done collaboratively. It could be, kind of class groups, tables. One side write the arguments for, one side write the arguments against, so that you've got this brilliant idea. You swap it around, see if things can be added, whether they could use like focusing on certain kind of lexical features. We're going to try to use this word. We're going to try to avoid using this word. Loads of little things like that. And that comes on to the advice. How do you provide effective feedback for students? The public band descriptors are your best resource in helping you understand where you want to pitch your students' scoring or feedback, but also rather than saying, I didn't like the idea or it could be better, you're able to specifically target certain points or ideas. So that's why we'd highly encourage you to use the public band descriptors.
All right, so we just have a few more minutes here. So I just want to make sure that I give the homework assignments. Next week, we'll be focusing on IELTS speaking. We'll be looking at the different tasks and skills that are targeted throughout the IELTS speaking test, and features are present for effective communication. Again, we'll be taking a deep dive look into IELTS band descriptors for speaking and how an examiner would apply those band descriptors. So you're going to have a pre-session task again, which we'll be sending out through the chat and through email. Sorry, this is not the updated link, but the updated link is available in the handouts, which I'll pass through in a moment. Again, you'll be given a sheet where you can mark your scores just like an examiner would, and we're asking you to note the strengths and weaknesses for each of the marking criteria, and I'll be providing you with the public band descriptors as well, and there will be a link for you to submit those results. So I'll just go ahead and stop sharing now. I think we have just a few moments that we can answer some extra questions, and I'll drop those resources into the chat box.
Okay, so while you're doing that, Erica, thank you to Dr. Joanna, who has been answering some questions. And let's just jump into one or two of them. If the words are not 150 for task 1 and the other one for task 2, will it affect the scoring? They're guidelines. They're guidelines of like the appropriate amount to write. If something is massively short, it's not really about the words. It's just you haven't had the opportunity to display a range of language or, a range of vocabulary or structures. So don't over focus on that score of, 150, or likewise for task 2. Don't worry about that too much with your students. Just focus on the quality of writing. It's a guideline only. There's a question about having certificates. Of course, contact British Council Uzbekistan for that. We're not providing any certificates directly, but any questions related to that can go to our organisers. So Joanna's answered 1 or 2 of those. Conclusion, I think, has been answered by Joanna as well. Thank you, Joanna. Okay, I think that wraps it up. Joanna's answered a lot of those questions very nicely. Perfect, on the hour.
So just to reiterate, I've dropped the IELTS band descriptors into the chat box. They are available on the IELTS website, or if you Google IELTS public band descriptors, a lot of results will come up there, available on a number of different websites. As we mentioned in the first session, the most reliable ones are going to be the official IELTS owners, such as British Council, Cambridge, and IDP. I've also put in the handout, so where you would put your speaking scores. Included in that is the updated YouTube link, where you will find the audio samples that we will be asking you to listen to and rate. We are also going to send through, so that's 2 resources that are in the chat now. That is the pre-assignment task for next week. I'm also going to be dropping now some high-level samples for task 1 and task 2. There are 2 samples each for the exact same practice tasks that we've gone over today. I saw somebody asking for some higher level samples. So when you look at these resources, you will see the noticeable difference between the one that you had that we reviewed today, and then these samples that I'm just sending through now.
Thank you, everybody, for your attendance, and thank you for British Council Uzbekistan for putting this together. It's lovely to see you all, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yep. Enjoy your homework.
Thank you.